Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're diving into something, well, pretty fundamental to your life as an American citizen.
Oh, laying down the law right out the gate?
You could say that. It's all about the challenges facing American democracy, which, is kind of a big deal.
Can't argue with that.
We've got a series of slides here that are actually pretty insightful, and we're not going to just focus on the problems, but we'll dig into some potential solutions too.
Sounds comprehensive.
We'll even get a little global, a little historical, see how the U.S. experience stacks up against other countries, and, what we can maybe learn from past struggles and all that.
So a real deep dive then.
Exactly. But first, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about your expertise, what you bring to the table today?
Sure. Well, I've spent over 2 decades studying democratic systems, both here in the U.S. and around the world. My research focuses on the social and political factors that contribute to democratic stability, or, as we'll be discussing today, instability.
Perfect. And full disclosure, we're working from some really interesting source material today. We've got academic studies, historical analyses, even some public opinion polls. So we're coming at this from multiple angles, which I always appreciate.
It's great. These slides go beyond just the nuts and bolts of voting and elections. They really get into those deeper kind of underlying pressures that are impacting, well, the very foundation of our democratic system.
And speaking of those pressures, the sources we're looking at paint a pretty stark picture. One of the slides uses this really striking metaphor of a judge's gavel, shattered.
Powerful image.
It is. It really captures that sense of fragility, I guess, that a lot of people are feeling about our democracy. But the question is it really that bad? Or are we just, getting caught up in all the doom and gloom?
Well, the slides do lay out 4 key pressures that are definitely, contributing to that unease: political polarization, social and economic inequality, misinformation and disinformation, and threats to the rule of law.
Okay, so a lot to unpack there. And honestly, we're all feeling the effects of political polarization these days. It's like everywhere you turn, it's us versus them, right?
Exactly. And it's not just a feeling. The data in these slides backs it up, shows that this polarization is impacting everything, from elections and how the government functions to policymaking. It's creating gridlock and this feeling that the system just isn't working anymore. One of the studies cited here found that legislative productivity has tanked, like decreased by over 60% in the last decade. And a lot of that is just partisan gridlock.
Wow, 60%. That's a staggering number. And what about social and economic inequality? It's interesting. The sources we have suggest that the American dream, that classic idea, might actually be more attainable now for certain groups. But at the same time, others are being left behind. Is that a fair assessment?
It is a complex issue for sure. But yeah, the data does seem to support that whole idea of a widening gap. So while some groups have seen real, tangible economic gains, others are being left behind. And that leads to resentment, division, and a lack of trust in the institutions that are supposed to be serving everyone. One report even argues that this growing inequality is actually a bigger threat to democracy than, say, foreign interference or terrorism.
Wow, that's a pretty bold statement. And then, of course, we've got this tidal wave of misinformation and disinformation to contend with. It feels like it's almost impossible to agree on even basic facts anymore.
It's a real challenge. The slides point to, the decline of trust in traditional media. And then there's the rise of these echo chambers online where people are basically just getting fed information that confirms what they already believe.
The sources call them information silos, which I think is a pretty apt description.
It is. It's not even that we're just disagreeing on the issues anymore. It's that we can't even agree on the facts. And one of the studies actually found that exposure to misinformation can actually make people less likely to participate in politics.
Really? I guess it makes sense, though. If you feel like you can't trust anything, why bother?
Right, exactly. It becomes this vicious cycle where misinformation leads to apathy, which further weakens democratic institutions. And then, of course, we can't ignore the threats to the rule of law. I mean, we've seen challenges to the peaceful transfer of power, which is, like democracy 101.
Absolutely. That's a cornerstone of any democracy.
Yeah.
And the sources provide some, honestly, pretty chilling examples of this democratic backsliding, not just in the U.S., but around the world. They point to restrictions on voting rights, the weakening of checks and balances, attempts to undermine the independence of the judiciary. It's pretty concerning stuff.
It is. But to play devil's advocate for a moment, haven't there also been countries that have actually made progress in strengthening their democracies? Like, what can we learn from those successes? The good guys, so to speak.
That's a great question. And yeah, the slides do highlight some positive examples. particularly in countries that have focused on things like civic education, strengthening independent media, and implementing, electoral reforms to ensure that elections are fair and transparent.
So it's not all doom and gloom then?
No, not necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
But it does require a conscious effort, both from individuals and from institutions, to safeguard and strengthen democratic values. And I think that's a really important point. The U.S., despite its history as this, like, beacon of democracy, we're not immune to these global trends.
Not at all. We're all in this together, for better or worse.
Exactly. So, given all that, what can we learn from the past? How has the U.S. dealt with these kinds of challenges before?
Well, one thing the sources really emphasize is the importance of historical context. They remind us that the U.S. has, a long and complex history. We've had moments of incredible democratic resilience, but we've also had our fair share of struggles.
We've had our ups and downs.
Exactly. And looking back at those past challenges can be really valuable. It can give us insights into how we might approach the issues we're facing today.
It's like that saying, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it.
Exactly. And, the U.S. Constitution is often referred to as a living document, something that's adaptable to change. But does history actually back that up?
It's a good question. I mean, it's one thing to say it, but another to see it in action.
Right. But the slides point to a ton of examples of how the Constitution has been amended and reinterpreted throughout history to address, new challenges, changing social norms. Think about the abolition of slavery, the expansion of suffrage, the civil rights movement. These were all moments where the U.S. was grappling with really fundamental questions about democracy and equality. And ultimately, we adapted our laws and institutions to reflect a more inclusive vision of society.
So history doesn't just offer warnings, it offers hope, too.
Exactly. The sources really emphasize that while democracy is fragile, it's also incredibly resilient. And by learning from the past, from both our successes and our failures, we can figure out how to protect and strengthen our democratic institutions for future generations.
And that's ultimately what it's all about.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so we talked about these pressures on democracy in, kind of a broad sense. But how do they actually manifest in our institutions? Like, how is this actually playing out?
Well, one of the visuals we have here is this image of a ballot box just sitting alone in this grand empty hall. It's a pretty powerful image.
It is. And kind of lonely, too.
Yeah. And I think it reflects the potential consequences of these pressures. We see it in the weakening of democratic institutions, in efforts to suppress voting rights, gerrymandering, manipulating electoral boundaries, and we see it in the erosion of public trust in government and the media.
And the sources suggest that these tactics, they're not just about winning elections. It's bigger than that.
Right. It's about undermining that fundamental principle of one person, one vote.
It's about power.
Exactly. Yeah. And the impact goes way beyond just the electoral process. It creates this climate of, cynicism and distrust. And that makes it harder to, address any of the challenges we face. It's like a vicious cycle.
It's like we're stuck.
In a way, yeah.
And speaking of public trust, it seems like it's been eroded by a number of factors. Inequality, corruption, a lack of transparency.
All of that, yeah. And all those factors just feed into this sense of disillusionment and disengagement. When people feel like the system is rigged against them or that their voices don't matter, they're less likely to participate.
They check out.
They do. So where does that leave us? I mean, we've got gridlock, ineffective governance, social unrest. It's not a pretty picture.
It's not. But, the sources do offer a glimmer of hope. They talk about how recognizing these challenges is the first step towards actually addressing them, and they highlight the power of collective action. Citizens, organizations, the government, all working together to find solutions.
There's still time to turn things around.
So it's not time to throw in the towel just yet.
Absolutely not. In fact, in the next segment, we're going to dig into those potential solutions. We'll look at the role of civic engagement, institutional reforms, and how important education and media literacy are.
Because we can't just sit here and complain. We have to do something.
Exactly. Knowledge is power, but action is even more powerful. So we've explored, the pressures, the historical context, all of that. But now I think it's time to shift gears a little bit and really dive into what we can actually do about all of this. Like, what are the solutions?
Yeah, exactly. We've talked about the what, but now let's get to the how. And these slides actually offer some pretty concrete steps that we can all take.
Absolutely. And I think the most fundamental action in any democracy is, informed voting. which might seem kind of obvious, but
It's more than just showing up at the polls, right?
right. It's about, doing your research, understanding the issues, and voting for candidates who genuinely represent your values.
Yeah.
And, with the rise of misinformation, it's more important than ever to be really careful about where we're getting our information from.
To actually fact check things before we share them online.
Exactly. That whole media literacy thing is just crucial in the digital age. We need to be critical consumers of information, to question our own biases, and to, be wary of anything that feels, I don't know, sensationalized or emotionally
Right.
charged.
Don't just believe everything you read on the internet.
Exactly. And beyond voting, the slides also talk about the importance of advocacy. Contacting our elected officials, supporting organizations that are working on issues we care about, even running for office ourselves.
Getting involved.
Right. It's about recognizing that we're not just passengers on this, democratic journey,
Yeah.
We're the drivers. And that means taking an active role in shaping the direction we're headed.
Love that analogy.
Mhm.
And the sources also highlight the importance of community engagement, volunteering, attending town hall meetings, joining local organizations. All of these are ways to get involved and make a difference at the grassroots level.
It's about building social capital, fostering connections within our communities, and, well, working together to solve local problems. And strong communities are really the foundation of a strong democracy.
They're the building blocks. And while all those individual actions are super important, we can't ignore the need for bigger systemic change.
Mhm.
That's where institutional reforms come in, right?
Exactly. And the slides highlight a few key areas like, campaign finance reform to reduce the influence of special interests, electoral reforms to make sure elections are fair and accessible, and strengthening the mechanisms for, accountability and transparency in government.
Right. And these reforms, I mean, they're not going to be easy, but they're kind of essential for creating a more level playing field and restoring public trust in our institutions.
Right. And what's interesting is that all of these solutions, they're kind of interconnected. Like individual actions can help drive systemic change, and institutional reforms can create a more supportive environment for civic engagement.
So it's like this positive feedback loop.
Exactly. And one of the reports actually dives into this case study of a grassroots movement that successfully pushed for campaign finance reform at the state level. And it's a great example of how, ordinary citizens can actually make a real difference, even when it comes to these big, complex, systemic issues.
It's inspiring. It shows that change is possible.
It does. And it highlights that whole idea of collective action. It's not about waiting for someone else to fix things. It's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in shaping the future of our democracy.
So it's a call to action then, an invitation to step up and become active participants in safeguarding our democracy.
I think so. And it's not about being a superhero or having all the answers. It's about taking those small but meaningful steps, engaging in our communities, and holding our leaders accountable.
Right. And the sources seem to suggest that this is an ongoing process, right? It's not like we fix it and then we're done.
Yeah.
Democracy requires this constant, vigilance and adaptation and a willingness to engage in those difficult conversations.
Yeah, it's a journey, not a destination. And, while the challenges are definitely real, so too is the potential for, renewal and progress. The future of American democracy really does rest on our collective shoulders.
Wow. That's a powerful thought. I think it's easy to feel kind of overwhelmed by the scale of all of this, but this conversation has really highlighted, how important individual action is. And that positive change is possible. What are your thoughts? We've covered a lot of ground today. The pressures on American democracy, the historical context, potential solutions. It's a lot.
It is. It can be, honestly, pretty heavy stuff.
Yeah. It's easy to feel overwhelmed.
Yeah.
Even a little anxious about the future, all things considered.
I get it. They're complex issues with, with high stakes. And the sources we looked at, they definitely convey a sense of urgency. It's understandable to feel that weight.
So how do we stay engaged without burning out? How do we find hope amidst all these challenges?
Well, I think the key is finding that balance between, acknowledging how serious the situation is, but also maintaining a sense of agency and optimism. It's not about ignoring the problems, but approaching them with a more constructive mindset. One of the psychologists quoted in the slides talks about, active hope that whole idea that we can create change even when things seem really tough.
I like that active hope.
Yeah, it's about taking action. And for me, one thing that helps is focusing on the local level. It's easy to get caught up in national politics, but real change often starts in our own communities, you know?
It's less overwhelming that way, too.
Mm.
More manageable.
Right. And the slides actually highlight some really inspiring examples of local initiatives that are making a difference. Things like community policing programs, citizen-led efforts to combat misinformation, local organizations working to address economic inequality.
So, like, real people making a real difference.
Exactly. And it's also about, finding sources of inspiration, reading about historical figures who fought for social justice, connecting with people who share your values, celebrating those small victories. All of that can help to fuel our passion and keep us going.
Keep the fire burning.
Exactly. And it's fascinating to me how even in like the darkest of times throughout history, there have always been individuals and movements that have pushed for progress, for a more just and equitable society. And their stories, well, they remind us that change is possible, even when it seems impossible. One of the slides actually has this quote from Frederick Douglass: "If there is no struggle, there is no progress," which I think is just so powerful. A powerful reminder that, the fight for democracy is never really over.
It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Exactly. And we can't forget about self-care either, taking breaks from the news, spending time in nature, connecting with loved ones. All of that is so essential for our mental and emotional well-being, and that's crucial for staying engaged over the long haul.
Yeah, you can't pour from an empty cup, right?
Exactly. Caring for ourselves allows us to show up more fully for our communities, for the causes we believe in.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the challenges facing American democracy, I'm left with, I don't know, a sense of cautious optimism, I guess.
Yeah.
The challenges are real, but so is the potential for positive change.
Yeah. And these slides, they offer a roadmap not just for understanding the problems, but for taking action. They remind us that democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires active participation, critical thinking, a willingness to engage in those tough conversations, even with people who see things differently than we do.
Right. It's about embracing the messiness, the complexities,
Yeah.
and, that ongoing struggle to create a more perfect union.
And ultimately, it's about believing that together we can make a difference.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive. We hope this conversation has been informative, thought-provoking, and empowering. Now go out there and be the change you want to see in the world.